Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is John DeBenedictis. I'm the Executive Director for the National Soccer Coaches Association of Canada. It's a volunteer position, and all of us on the board are volunteers looking to bring better or more coaching education to coaches, and not just coaching education on the field, but anything that's interesting off the fields. We've interviewed authors and Hollywood movie producers, anything that I think is a little different. So today, I'm honored to have William Humber, the author of a book called Soccer Triumphant. And he's got a long list of credentials, which I'll have you explain in a minute, including publishing a number of books. But we also have a special guest today, and that's his son, Bradley, who co-wrote the book Soccer Triumphant, and he's also the president of the Red Patch. It's phenomenal. So William, maybe give us a little bit more information on yourself.
Well, I grew up with soccer. My dad came out from England after the war, and he brought his West Ham United fandom with him and kind of inculcated some of us, at least, in that fandom, and played the game as a kid growing up. Discovered when I played at Victoria College at the University of Toronto in 1969, I was playing on one of the oldest soccer teams in North America. I didn't actually discover that until I started writing this book, and I was kind of proud of that little, useless piece of information. So I've continued to follow the game. This is my second book on soccer. Wrote a kind of a kid's introductory book before the 1994 Olympics in the United States. I've done I'm best known, I guess, to many people for my work on baseball. I was inducted into the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame for my historic writing, and received the Order of Canada within the last 6 months. So it's been a busy and great time I've had, at least. Over to you, Brad.
Yeah, I'm Brad Humber, and I've been my soccer fandom kind of correlated with the 2006 World Cup. Before then, I was more of a very casual fan, not really wanting to get up earlys in the mornings. I'm not a morning person, so the 7:45 soccer centrals on TSN or Sportsnet were a little bit of a chore for watching the Premier League, but grew to appreciate the game when I actually did attend my first World Cup in 2006. Became a fan, the year after Toronto FC got their franchise in MLS Soccer. For a few years, working on trying to get season tickets through different avenues since I wasn't in right off the hop. Became a member of the Red Patch Boys supporters group in 2013, and have been the president of the group since the beginning of the 2020 season. And as a full-time job, I'm also working as an associate producer at Rogers Sportsnet in Toronto.
Oh, it's fantastic. Great to hear that. And we're honored to have both of you here. And the book here is Soccer Triumphant. I just finished reading it a couple of days ago. Thanks for my copy.
Great. There'll be a skill testing quiz, John.
Yeah, my memory isn't as good as it used to be. Never was good, to be honest. But anyhow, I have highlighted some sections. And, the thing about, I guess the book, you talk about soccer is becoming more mainstream again, and in the media, and the number of kids playing and professional soccer. But you take us on a bit of a tour, a little bit of a history lesson, and you start off in Columbus. The book starts off in Columbus, Ohio, where you talk about the Columbus Crew. If I'm not mistaken, the Columbus Crew were one of the original members of the MLS when it first formed after the 1994 World Cup. And I think they were probably the first city to build a soccer-specific stadium. But even though they had that great history, they were threatening to move from Columbus to, I think, Austin, Texas.
Yep.
And so you guys talk about in the first part of the book, crew. So who saved the crew? The crew who saved the crew. And which was moving franchises in unhappy North American tradition. So maybe give us a bit of insight into that.
Well, there were really three kind of heroes, I guess you could say. The fans initially, because they said they wanted to keep their team. Oftentimes when a team moves, that people have kind of given up the hope. But people like Morgan Hughes that I met in Columbus, who's quite a fanatical follower of the game. He actually grew up as a football fan of the gridiron version. But he was, part of that group. I guess the second one would be the Ohio State Legislature, which passed legislation after the move of the Cleveland Browns franchise to Baltimore, which essentially said that you have to give a certain grace period if you are intending to move, at which other people can make an attempt to purchase the team or to otherwise get involved with it, with saving it in that particular city. And that was an important holding action. And then the third was the Haslam family, who did invest in the new Cleveland Browns franchise. And they put their money behind purchasing the crew together with a number of people in the city itself. And so not only did they save the team, then they smartly brought in Tim Bezbatchenko, of course, who was the, in many respects, the architect of those great TFC teams that went to multiple championships in the MLS, and really made a quick building of that franchise so that they won the MLS championship a couple of years ago. So it's a really kind of a wonderful story of not only a team that was saved, but went on to, great things afterwards.
Right, that's pretty interesting for a government to get involved in passing a law where they don't want a franchise to leave town. Do you have any more info on that part of it?
Yes, basically the legislation said, look, where the public has invested money and resources in a stadium or in infrastructure surrounding a stadium, in other words, where there is a public participation in that process financially, then a owner of a franchise is obligated to engage the local community and determine whether there's an interest there in purchasing the team and keeping it in the particular environment place that it is. And as I say, really, it was a holding action. It allowed time for those good investors to come forward.
Wow, that's fantastic for Columbus, and of course, it sounds like they're here to stay. And it looks like they're going to be building a new stadium. I think that's
they built a new stadium. Yes, they have. They have a new stadium in the downtown. Columbus is kind of a, for anybody who knows Columbus, I did find this somewhat amusing. They did say that Mapre Stadium, where they had played, was kind of out of town. Well, in fact, it's about 4 miles from the downtown, and I thought 4 miles in a big city is probably midtown, But in Columbus's case, they built the new stadium right downtown, where their hockey arena is and where their baseball stadium for their international league team is as well.
And so that just recently opened, I'm assuming?
Yes. Yeah, I think it was just within the last year. Brad, do you know anything more about it?
Yep. TFC actually opened one of their, I believe it was their second game of the season this year at the new stadium. So, I think it opened mid last season around July, and now it's full steam ahead for them there in Columbus. And the good thing about Columbus, it is very much it is a college town. So the issues, with the crew was, from my vantage point, was that they weren't doing enough to get that college, kind of atmosphere that you see from college games, or those kind of fans from college. Like, you get 100,000 people out to the Horseshoe to watch Ohio State play, but they were struggling to get 5,000 people into Matt Free Stadium. And I mean, it's on a different schedule. Football's August to November, and basically co-aligning with school. And I mean, basically the MLS season goes from end of February to beginning of October. So you have that whole summer period where it's hard to attract people. But I think a lot of that, came down to why wasn't, Columbus doing more to try to attract, people in the city. That if you get 100,000 people into the Horseshoe, surely you could get 10% of that into a soccer game. You would hope, at least.
Good. Yeah, I remember being in St. Louis for the coaches convention run by the then National Soccer Coaches Association of America, which is where we started from, NSCAC, and now they're called United Soccer Coaches. And I remember going to a hockey game there. I believe it was the Chicago Blackhawks in St. Louis. Oh, sorry, I'm talking about the wrong city. That's the next.
It's all right. We've got
next on
St.
the
Louis
list.
in the book too.
Sorry about that too. Yeah, St. Louis is in the book as well. So just before we leave Columbus, I think you mentioned somewhere that the type of demographics of Columbus might be different than cities like Atlanta or Toronto.
Yeah, that's a really good point. One of the things that Tim Bezpachenko pointed out, he knew when he came to Toronto that he was dealing with a diverse ethnic background that had a lot of history of the game, a lot of familiarity with it, and it was really a matter of tapping into that. Whereas in Columbus, you didn't have as large a, for want of a better term, ethnic population, and so there's a pretty big education process involved in terms of engaging people with. In many respects, for them, it was a new game. It was something that they were not familiar with, and so that has been and probably continues to be one of the challenges in the city. But it's one that they recognize and they're dealing with directly.
Good. Now, I forgot to mention, if you have any questions, you can ask it in the Q&A. Now, there is a question about from a Jim Leaker about allowing me in. I don't think the way the webinars are set up, you can allow, it's not like a meeting where you can allow people in. So just, if you have any questions, just type them in. Now, I'm not a super technical guy. So I don't want to lose everybody by trying something, but that would probably be best. If you have any questions, just type it in there. But the name is familiar because it's in the book. And maybe you can explain a little bit about Jim.
Well, Jim is, I wouldn't go, and he'd probably be embarrassed if I called him Mr. Soccer in St. Louis. He's the president of the St. Louis Soccer Hall of Fame. He was a professional player himself in the old North American Soccer League. Before that, he played at the university level. St. Louis has a fabulous soccer history, and indeed, it could be seen as kind of the center of soccer in the United States. When the game, one of the points we make in the book is that soccer was mainstream in the 19th century, and indeed, if you looked around the globe at that time, other than the game in the British Isles, in basically England, Scotland, the next two big countries in the world in soccer were the United States and Canada. And that's because we got in on the ground floor, and there are a lot of reasons for that. Well, St. Louis was one of the places that started that into the game very early in their history. Shortly thereafter, the formation of the modern soccer rules in 1863, and just continued to do that. And one of the secrets of St. Louis's success was that they based it on developing local talent. And one of the observations that was made was that many universities, colleges in the United States would rely on offshore talent to boost their lineups, to as it were, make them, a more competitive team. St. Louis didn't do that. They went after local, they built their local base, they built their local talent, they put them through their school system. One amusing thing about it, though, and I'll tell this, and I don't even know if Jim Leaker has heard this story. I was at a baseball gathering in June, and Lloyd Moseby was there. And Lloyd Moseby was a great baseball center fielder for the Toronto Blue Jays. And he grew up in St. Louis. And I started telling him the story of soccer in St. Louis, and he didn't believe me. He just, oh, come on. No, that's not true. There's no soccer in St. Louis. And at first I thought, like, did you actually grow up in St. Louis, Lloyd? But there was a very good reason for that. And that is that very early in the soccer history of St. Louis, it was very much identified as an important outreach aspect of the Roman Catholic Church in the city, to the point that one Monsignor referred to soccer as the eighth sacrament, a little comment that I stole from Bill McDermott in St. Louis. And therefore, it was very much associated with the European-based, largely white community that had come from Europe and were now living in St. Louis. Whereas the Black community in St. Louis were largely Protestant. They'd come up from the American South. They were Baptists, Pentecostals, whatever, and they just weren't exposed to the game. And, you know, it was interesting at the dinner we went to in St. Louis, there was a recognition that, boy, you know, you really need to broaden the base of participation, because this is some of the incredible talent that you're losing. These are, you know, kids that are ultimately going into basketball or football or whatever. And, you know, if you get into that community pretty early, you got a really good chance of getting them involved. And it was kind of what I found in Atlanta, actually, that initiatives had been taken around their transit soccer league, as it were, to really engage the inner city Black community in Atlanta, and some of the dividends that's starting to pay off.
Good. Yeah, I think Jim has mentioned that if anyone has any questions for him, he would love to answer them. So if anyone has any questions, just type them in the question and answer. And he says he's just the president. Bill McDermott is nicknamed Mr. Soccer.
It's always good when you have more than one Mr. Soccer in it, or Mrs. Soccer for that matter, or Miss Soccer in a community. You want all kinds of them, so that there's almost a debate over who is, you know, the premier title holder.
And you know, St. Louis, we're going to stick with St. Louis before we jump to Atlanta. But if I'm not mistaken, when the U.S. beat England,
yep,
were most of the players from the St. Louis area, or did they train there, or do you know the background on that?
Absolutely. Over half the team was St. Louis based. Were St. Louis kids. Were St. Louis. You know, they'd grown up in the community, to the point that in St. Louis now there's what they call the Hall of Fame street that has, I believe it's either 5 or 6 of the members of that team that incredibly upset England in 1950 on that street. That street also, intriguingly, was also the street that Yogi Berra, the great baseball catcher, grew up on too. So it is aptly named Hall of Fame Street. And you know, it's hard to think of a bigger upset in soccer than that 1951. And there's a lovely story that the New York Times, when they received the score of the game 1-0 for the United States, just assumed it was a misprint and printed the score of the game, England 10, United States 1. Well, it wasn't. It was 1-0. Wow. Brad was in Rio for the World Cup in 2014. He was also there in South Africa in 2010. So he got a feeling for soccer in those two communities as well.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so with St. Louis, I believe they've applied and now are going to be joining the MLS. Is that correct?
Yeah, they're joining next season, 2023. They'll have the expansion draft, and they'll have their, I believe they get the first overall pick in the MLS Super Draft as well. I'm not quite sure about that, but yeah, they are definitely joining in 2023, and they've got like a beautiful new soccer-specific stadium that they're using as well. Some of these new teams are coming into NFL stadiums like in Charlotte, or baseball stadiums in New York City for NYCFC, but they've got a brand new soccer-specific stadium that they're actually going to be moving into as well, which looks pretty nice as well.
Wow, great. Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of surprised it took so long for St. Louis to get back into, you know, top-rate professional soccer.
We go into a little bit in the book of some of the ups and downs that they had in the community in terms of, you know, attempting to make that happen. But it has happened, and that's really the most important thing for the game in St. Louis.
And they're you know, you mentioned here, actually, it's Jim Leake mentions.
Jim Leaker, yeah,
Jim Leaker. He mentions in the book, as opposed to Columbus, that there seems to be a lot of immigrants quote here German, Italian, and Polish. You know what happens when you get older? Your eyes go on you. All right. German, Italian, Polish communities in St. Louis were big supporters of soccer as immigration played a part. Having their own section in St. Louis, and so you go on about that in the book as well.
Yeah, one of the things they do in St. Louis, and well, we were fortunate to be there for it around Columbus Day. Columbus doesn't have a very good reputation. I mean, Columbus the Explorer, not the city. Columbus the Explorer doesn't have a very good reputation these days, but he still has a following, as it were, in St. Louis, and they do an annual parade around Columbus Day, and my wife and I were happy to be participants in that parade that Jim led through the streets of St. Louis. One of the ironies I pointed out at the time to the folks in St. Louis is, here I am from Toronto, and you're celebrating having just won the Stanley Cup in St. Louis, whereas we are just coming from Toronto, where we're just celebrating winning the NBA championships. You know, usually you would have thought it would have been flipped around somewhat to some extent, but it was really a cool moment to be able to be part of that parade.
Right, and Jim has stated here that there were 6 players and 5 starters from St. Louis, I guess, on that team, and MLS Next Pro just won the Western Championship.
Yeah, that's the developmental league that's just below MLS. Toronto FC has a team in that as well, and they actually won the East. So the playoffs actually start this weekend, and it was the first time Toronto FC 2, which they're aptly named as their basically academy team. It's the first time they've ever made the playoffs in the history of their academy. So quite an achievement both on Toronto and now this St. Louis MLS Next team as well for on the western side of the conference.
Good, and Jim also mentioned the Bosnian community, largest community, I guess, Bosnian community in the U.S.
Yes, yeah.
So I guess Edin Dzeko will be their designated player then. One of the big Bosnian strikers who's currently playing in Europe. Moving on in years, and you never know, MLS does like to bring in big names to start off franchises.
Yeah, and I think maybe David Beckham had something to do with that. We'll talk about him later. Just jumping back to Atlanta, I guess that was in before St. Louis in your book. You talk about Atlanta, how I mean, for me, I remember in the old North American Soccer League days.
Yeah.
I had a team, was never really very good team that I remember, and whenever Toronto would play in Atlanta, you'd see a game on TV, which wasn't very often. There was hardly anybody in the stands. So I was surprised when Atlanta United, jumped into the MLS, and next thing you know, they're averaging, I think we said here in the book, 51,000, 52,000 people, which I believe it's like the 10th or 11th biggest average crowd in the world.
Yeah, Brad was able to talk to Darren Eales, the then president of the Atlanta team. He's now moved across the ocean to Newcastle. Most people would see that as a step down. I don't know why. Maybe not Les Jones. I think Les, as I recall, is a Newcastle United fan. What are some of the things you noticed in Atlanta, Brad? You went there for a playoff game that TFC played in Atlanta, and they have an incredible tailgating experience there, as I recall.
Yeah, the one thing that I noticed from Atlanta that I would have thought that I would have seen a bigger, exposure like in Columbus was that it did kind of bring the party atmosphere of a college town, and a lot of the suburbs of Atlanta from the universities and stuff like that, the people that I met were a lot of students from universities outside in the suburbs of Atlanta, and they would come in and just enjoy the tailgating aspect of the party atmosphere, like at a college game where, if there's a game at 4:00, you're getting to your tailgate at 7 in the morning and you're tailgating right through until you got to get into the stadium. I saw the same thing in Atlanta where they would set up, hours before a game in what's called the Gulch, which was basically outside of Mercedes-Benz Arena. It's a massive parking lot area, and all the supporters groups would set up there and make it a full day event, more than just, you know, getting to the game and finding your seat. So I did find that, and it was shocking to me, because when Atlanta first got in, I would look at attendances at like the Atlanta Hawks basketball, and even you know, the Thrashers when they were there for the NHL, and you never really saw, outside of football, that like the Atlanta Falcons and even the Braves were the teams of Atlanta. And I never thought that I would see, why are you putting this in a 50,000, you know, seat football stadium? It's going to look awful, but it actually is an incredible stadium. I've been there a couple of times for Toronto FC playoff games. Both well, I was there at the final game in 2017 of the regular season, when at the time Toronto had clinched the most points ever in a regular season game. And then I was also there in 2019 for the Eastern Conference semifinals, when we defeated Atlanta and then went to Seattle for that MLS Cup final in 2019. But it's remarkable how that city embraces that team. And I don't know if it's maybe how they, as opposed to other sports, they keep their prices reasonable for a family, for a college student. I mean, you go in and I think the beers are like $3 or $4. You can get a hot dog for $2. You know, pop and chips are like $2 or $3. So everything is very, very reasonably priced within both the concessions and also their ticket prices. So they keep it so they can get, you know, people into the stadium and at a reasonable price as well, which is remarkable.
One of the fascinating things I think about Atlanta too is the way they adopted, as it were, their transit system, which was it's an inner city system. And what they built around 10 of the stations were little, I guess you could call them almost like auditoriums outside of the actual transit stop, where what they hoped would happen is people would stop and watch a performer or a play or something like that. Well, it never happened, because most people, when they're on public transit, you know, just use it and leave. But so it was taken over by the soccer community in Atlanta, and what they've done in several of the sites, and the plan is to go to all 10. What they've done is actually put down an artificial surface. There are seating there, and they've actually allowed the inner city kids in the African American communities in downtown Atlanta to get engaged in the game through that strategy, because the kids can all go to the game by public transit. It's really a cool kind of system that they developed in that city.
And I'm assuming they keep the prices down for kids who register, or?
Yeah, actually, the philosophy is that kids get in free into playing, and the only ones they charge are when a more affluent group wants to rent the space or wants to come in and have their own league games. They'll charge them, and they're happy to pay, because they realize that they're actually supporting the game. Really, you couldn't get more grassroots engagement than what they've done in Atlanta.
That's called the Soccer in the Streets program, is that?
That's it. Soccer in the streets, and you know, around their transit stations, their subway system, as it were. And it was pointed out to me in Atlanta that the game is, as it is in many parts of North America, very much a suburban game, in the sense that kids had to be driven, you know, considerable distances to play games. They needed, you know, I guess you could call it the proverbial soccer mom who had to drive the kids to the soccer. And so it left out a lot of kids in the inner city who didn't have those resources to be able to, you know, to travel, to pay the high, you know, fees for coaching and better training. And so this was really a clever means of kind of re-engaging, or in this case, just absolutely engaging people. But you mentioned, you know, the early Atlanta Chiefs who played in the North American Soccer League, and how, you know, you turn on the TV and there'd be 3,000 fans. I think that the things the NASL doesn't get enough credit for is that it was one of the earliest and most integrated of soccer leagues there was anywhere in the world. You know, at a time in the 80s and 90s when a Black player, say in England, would be, you know, hissed and booed and life made miserable for them. I think of a guy like Clyde Best. It was just natural in North America for those teams to be integrated. Nobody thought anything of it. And the wonderful story was about Kaiser Boy Motung, who played for the Atlanta Chiefs. And Atlanta Chiefs logo, I might add, was a Indian warhead, very politically incorrect today. But he took that logo to South Africa and formed his own team, the Kaiser Chiefs, who played in the All Black League in South Africa. And one of the players on that, it's a kind of a neat story. One of the guys in that team eventually was a guy named Lucas Radaby, who ended up playing with Leeds United. And a bunch of rock and roll enthusiasts in Leeds were so excited by this guy, Lucas Radaby, and his backstory of having played for the Kaiser Chiefs. They named their band the Kaiser Chiefs, and they have a certain following in the UK as a result of that. Well, who would have thought an English pop group name would derive ultimately from a North American soccer league team in the late 60s, early 70s?
Wow. Yeah, it's very interesting for sure. And the book has a lot of these stories and a great deal of research into the history of the game. I definitely recommend it again. We're talking to the authors, William and Brad Humber, and they've written a book called Soccer Triumphant. And they started off the book in Columbus, and then they talk about Atlanta and St. Louis. And then next chapter, they move on to Toronto, which is pretty much their hometown. I know they're just outside of Toronto. Mm-hmm. And we'll just talk a little bit about Toronto, because Toronto's got an interesting soccer history as well, with all the different leagues and semi-pro leagues and pro leagues, and a lot of players came over from the UK and then different parts of Europe play here. Maybe you might want to go through some of that.
Well, one of the, the great thing about soccer in North America, you know, there are exceptions, outstanding communities like St. Louis and the Darlington League that we talk about in the book. But generally speaking, it was those immigrant communities that kept the game alive, that kept the game flourishing, that engaged in the sport. And no community was bigger in Toronto than the post-Second World War Italian community. You know, the standard line was that, many of those Italian immigrants came with the promise that the streets would be paved with gold. And not only were they not paved with gold, but they were doing the paving. And but they became great soccer fans. And I tell a story in the book that Brad and I did about a game I went to with my brother in 1967 when Toronto played Chicago in the old it was called the United Soccer Association. It was one of the two rival professional leagues formed after the World Cup in England in 1966. And Toronto was playing Chicago. And late in the game, the referee made a somewhat controversial call, but in Toronto's favor. And Toronto scored off the ensuing play. And there were maybe 3 minutes to go in the game. I might add there were 15,000 fans at Old Varsity Stadium. And at that point, 14,998 of them decided to riot. They charged onto the turf to kill the referee. And I've often asked people, well, wait a minute, this game was played in Toronto. The call was favorable to Toronto. Toronto took the lead 2-1. What the heck was going on? Why were the fans so irate? And no one has been able to figure out the logic of it. Some people said, well, maybe they came all the way from Chicago. I said, in 1967, I don't think so.
No.
Or maybe Toronto fans are so fair-minded that they rioted in protest. I don't think so. No, what happened that year was they didn't have time, the USA, the United Soccer Association, to hire players for their team. So they actually hired teams. Toronto was represented by Hibernian, a great Scottish soccer team, and Chicago is represented by Cagliari of the Italian Serie. And needless to say, 14,998 fans were there to cheer for Cagliari. My brother and I were actually cheering for Toronto, but we soon switched over to join at least to boo as well with the rioters.
Right. Cagliari for those who are Italian and in the audience. Yeah, that's interesting. I do remember following that Scottish team that represented Toronto. My dad would just take me to games, so whoever's on the field, I cheer for whoever he cheered for. So I guess the Hibs, is that what they were? They're
Hibs,
green.
yes.
Were they not wearing green, if I'm not
Yes,
mistaken?
yes, they are.
Right.
Yeah.
And they were here for one season.
Correct.
And then there was the Toronto Falcons, I think, before them. And then Toronto Metros. So just going back to St. Louis just for 1 second. When I was in St. Louis for the coaches convention, very cold day, but there was a NHL hockey game, St. Louis and Chicago, and Dick Howard, who a friend of mine, but was my idol as a kid. We went to the game together. We couldn't find tickets, standing room only. We saw the Chicago St. Louis game. Dick Howard played for the Toronto Metros. He was a goalkeeper, and probably one of his best games that I can remember that I was at was when Toronto Metros played Santos, LA, and the boys, and he was a standout in that game. Of course, after that game, I wanted to become a goalkeeper, and I was playing on a team, Clare Lee, which we were kind of a first-year team playing rep soccer, and my goals against average must have been 8. So I wrote Dick Howard a letter asking him for some tips. In those days, you might get a postcard. I remember Maple Leafs, they'd send you a postcard. Johnny Bauer would send you a postcard. I don't know if he signed it, but Dick Howard wrote me an 8-page letter on tips on goalkeeping, which is unheard of for a professional, first-class gentleman. He played for Toronto Metros, and you did mention him in your book. He's got a section there.
Absolutely. Dick was very forthcoming that he made a choice when he had graduated from his post-secondary education in Britain to come to North America on the hope that with the enthusiasm that was generated by the World Cup in England in 1966 and following that there would be opportunities for him to play and ultimately develop, his own perspective on the game. And he was able to do that. He's a remarkable success story in terms of soccer, and told some lovely stories about playing, with later in his, when he was with FIFA and some of the involvement with some of the people that got in a little bit of trouble, I guess we could say, but, he had some opportunities to play with them. But he actually lost his position with the Metros when the Croatian community was engaged with the team. The Croatian community was asked by Toronto Metros organization if they could come in and help sponsor the team. And the league, the North American Soccer League, wasn't very thrilled by that news. And the reason was they didn't like to have an ethnic identity. Isn't it amazing that today the majority of teams in MLS all kind of use European or otherworldly monikers for their teams? It's quite fascinating to see how that's changed. But that wasn't the case in 1976. And of course, that great Metros Croatia team that everybody in NASL, North American Soccer League, hoped would lose, kept winning and winning and winning after they brought in people like Eusebio. And Eusebio was somewhat on the downside of his career at that point, but he was still a magician with the ball. And he led them all the way to the Soccer Bowl title over Minnesota and the Croatian community. And some of the people I spoke to say, really, it's really unfair that the Croatian community didn't get more credit for what they had done in terms of sponsoring the team and making it possible. The North American Soccer League immediately at the end of that season, after Metros Croatia had won, banned the use of what they called ethnic or European names for their teams. And so, they went back to essentially being the Toronto Metros, and didn't last much longer after that. And of course, eventually that franchise was replaced by the Toronto Blizzard, who of course were there until the end of the NASL in 1984.
Right. Yeah, just you mentioned here in the books with Eusebio. I mean, in Canada and in Toronto area, certainly some of the world's best have been here. Before that, Sir Stanley Matthews, I believe, played in Toronto area. But Eusebio, when he came over, mentioned in the book, played for Metros Croatia. The coach at the time, sorry, getting my glasses on again.
Yeah.
Ivan Markovic. He had another player on the team that he wanted Eusebio to pass him the ball, and so that he could do the scoring. And Eusebio said, again, this is a quote from the book in his broken English. I say to coach, how many goals I score? 600? How many goals he scored? 10. Want me to pass the ball to him? Needless to say, the coach was soon fired and was taken over by the assistant. That's a good quote. Jumping back to Dick Howard for a second, a little story from that game against Santos. Toronto Metros actually took a 2-0 lead against the world champions with Pele, and then the Toronto team received a red card, which I thought was unfair, and trying to play against 10 men against the best in the world. But Pele, Santos was awarded a penalty shot. Dick Howard, who was the keeper, went to Pele and before he took the kick and shook his hand and said, good luck. Well, Dick says Pele proceeded to put the ball in the corner without any problem. And years later, I guess at a FIFA World Cup meeting in Toronto, Pele and Dick Howard met, and Dick Howard said, "Hey, do you remember me? Oh yeah, you're that crazy Canuck. Tried to shake my hand. I had already scored 1,000 goals by then. That's not going to work." So that's a nice little story. Now, Les Jones, he's one of the top photographers in Canada, who's covered numerous World Cup, has a question, and he's on. He asks, Ontario's Western Football Association rep team played in St. Louis over Christmas in 1884. Played the first cross-border game in North America. He didn't, he says, I failed to find many details, wondering if any of you guys have heard about that game and tour.
Yeah. If we didn't cover it in the book, we probably didn't uncover it, but we perhaps make a controversial point in the book that when the United States played Canada in around 1885 or thereabouts, Canada won the game, by the way. That was the real first international soccer match ever held. And of course, the Brits would have none of it. They claimed England, versus Scotland. About 1872 was the first ever international match. But the last time I looked, England and Scotland were part of the same country. So while I realize they have separate representation in World Cups and international competition, they are not representatives of two different jurisdictions or two different entities. So anyway, that would be a lovely point to debate with my friends in Europe, in England and Scotland at some point. We give credit in the book actually to a guy named William Kerr, who was the treasurer of the Scottish Football Association, who actually came to Canada around in the mid 1870s and was quite disdainful of the game that was being played here. It was something called the Canadian game. And it was basically soccer with the added provision that you could actually use your hands to knock the ball down. You could actually almost dribble the ball with your hands in a kind of a basketball way. You couldn't carry it because that would be rugby as we know it, but it still had some of those old traditional ways of moving a ball forward that he was quite disdainful of and was one of the proponents of moving towards the rules that have been adopted for the Football Association in the UK. And that, of course, eventually happened. As for Kerr, he married well. He married into the Alexander Graham Bell family, and the rest of his life was taken up with promoting telephones, and eventually ended up promoting beer in Western United States. So some of these incredible characters that I knew nothing about until we started digging into the book and finding them. Turns out his long after that, many generations later, relative was Tuesday Weld, the American actress, of course, who was known for her affairs with, amongst others, Elvis Presley. So when you find those kind of stories, they kind of enliven the picture of the game in North America.
Right. And just jumping back to Toronto, you did interview our former mayor,
Yes.
David Miller, who had a lot to do with bringing a soccer-specific stadium, with BMO Field in Toronto. You might want to talk a little bit about that
Yeah, David Miller is quite engaged with the game in Toronto. Brad, I think he's a big supporter, is he not?
Yeah, he's been with, and he's been with Red Patch Boys for a while. I mean, if you go back, I still have vivid memories of when we won MLS Cup, and he was there in the now defunct Shoeless Joe's, enjoying a few bevies after, to say the least. And he was always there, pregame, postgame, in the mix with just us, the regular supporters, folks, very much engaged and very much passionate about the TFC team, and still is.
It was David's belief that some of the early work that the Canadian Soccer Association had done in alliance with the federal government to put a stadium in Toronto for that I believe under 20 tournament, they were just looking at the wrong places. They were never going to be able to redevelop Varsity Stadium. There was too many objections locally. Moving it to north of Toronto was not a viable thing. And he always felt very strongly that the Liberty Village area of Toronto needed that kind of boost, that kind of incentive. As he pointed out, there was a lot of activity there during the day when people might be working there, but not much at night and not much beyond that. And he was quite correct in that. And putting the stadium where it is now has been, for all intents and purposes, the perfect location in Toronto. And of course, that's where undoubtedly the 2026 World Cup, we trust in some form, will be played. And that stadium will obviously need to be expanded. But if you're coming by public transit or any other means, it really is a kind of an ideal location. And David Miller really deserves a lot of the credit for the city building opportunity that putting that stadium where it is today was such a brilliant idea.
Great. I think anything. I think from soccer fans in Toronto, any soccer specific stadium anywhere would have been better than nothing. So. I think that's changed things a lot, having a soccer specific stadium.
And it's kind of an anomaly in MLS because you don't find that many downtown or like just off the downtowns soccer specific stadiums in MLS. A lot of them are on the outskirts or in suburbs of the main city, whether that be New York or Philadelphia or even kind of Seattle. Seattle's a little bit, you can walk to the downtown, but for the most part, for like with this actual soccer specific stadium, it's kind of one of the rare things that you see that it's you can walk to the downtown even if you wanted to. It's a little bit of a walk, a 40-minute, but like you could take transit and you're there in 20 minutes.
Right. Let me just ask you, Brad, a real quick question. Back to Atlanta for a second. A lot of these NFL football stadiums, they're not wide enough to host, say, a World Cup size field. I'm assuming Atlanta, because it's a fairly new stadium, their stadium was fine for soccer.
Yep, they were. Yeah, exactly. Some of them, you really notice it, say, when the New York NYCFC expansion club from a few years back moved into and uses Yankee Stadium as their home pitch, and it is it's not as wide, and its dimensions are still within a FIFA regulation, but at the very bare minimum of a FIFA regulation. But it's there. It's one of the smallest stadium. I think it probably is the smallest stadium dimensions within MLS itself that's allowable, just because of how it's situated inside of a baseball stadium. More of the football stadiums, like you said, some of them, they do move seats. They're able to move seats back out to make a bigger area. And even BMO Field was kind of like that. In order to support getting the Argos in, they had to actually take out seats and move it back because the end zones are actually bigger.
Right.
So
Right.
when they put in like the end zones in BMO Field, it's actually most of the playing field is grass, but the actual end zones are an artificial turf because of having to extend that.
And just going back to Toronto, I remember when the Toronto FC started, I was debating whether I should get season tickets. I figured that never going to sell out. It's based on the history from when the Blizzard folded in '84 and the Lynx tried. Then figured no problem. And so at the beginning, the sales were kind of pretty brisk, but I figured no problem. And then the MLS goes ahead and signs David Beckham, and the season ticket sales in Toronto started to ramp up again. And I said, I better quickly get my bid in, and had them ever since. But when Toronto started, they took a different attitude, I think, to promote the game more in the traditional way, as opposed to trying to bring families, with supporters groups. Well, Brad, you probably know about supporters groups because there's the Red Patch Boys, there's the Ultras, I believe. Where's yours? Is all the Rhythm,
Tribal Rhythm Nation. Yep, U Sector, Kings in the North. Yep.
And I think that Toronto changed the whole MLS philosophy and how to promote the game. Maybe you can give us some insight into that, because you did say in the book Toronto's leading role, and no doubt noisy TFC matches. So yeah, go.
Yeah, if you look at what the presence that supporters groups brought from Toronto specifically to the league, and I know Don Garber, the commissioner of MLS, always speaks highly of Toronto and what they did to build, the supporter culture and the supporter fandom that you actually now see within the league. It was when TFC came into the league, it was a completely party atmosphere. You weren't really going to the match to watch the game. You were going there to have a kick back a few beverages with your friends and have a good time at a fairly decent price point. Beverage prices aside, but your ticket price was very reasonable to get into, and it's a 2-hour match. You're going there, have some drinks, have some fun, whatever. But what Toronto brought was you saw it in the very early years, and now you're not allowed to use it, but you see the exorbitant amount of streamers. You would see the exorbitant amount of flags within one section of a stadium, which normally you see within different parts of European leagues, whether that's in Bundesliga, especially in Germany, or in or Italy. A lot of these leagues, not so much in the Premier League, but it was more, and even had like a kind of a South American feel with like all the streamers, because you didn't really see that. So it kind of like Toronto being such a multicultural city, you had all these diverse fan groups of different ways of supporting, whether they're from their motherland of Argentina and Brazil, or from Poland, or Croatia, or wherever. They would come all together into these actual supporters groups, and brought a flair that MLS had never actually seen, and just carry that in to other teams, which you would now see, like Seattle is now stepping up when they moved into their stadium, and you can see just how big some of the massive tifos, because tifos were never really a thing in MLS before, but even that, it just was the tipping point, and then it just grew bigger and bigger and bigger, and now you see supporters groups are a massive part of day-to-day operations within every club, and every club has we now have a dedicated person within the front office of Toronto FC that myself as the president of a supporters group and all the other supporters groups, we are now basically a team that works tandem in with the team to, if we're going to be doing huge display, they can give us maybe some space to do our painting, or if we're planning on doing something, we let them know to coordinate it through, the start of a match. So it's just become, it's day-to-day operation now.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Darren Eales said to you, Brad, when you talked to him, what made soccer finally go and return, as it were, to where it was in the 19th century is we stopped trying to North Americanize it. The old North American Soccer League, at least in the early, they'd have cheerleaders, they'd have timeouts, they'd have all these kind of stupid things that everyone took for granted in every other, mainstream sport in North America. But soccer people, it just didn't make sense. And once they said, hey, wait a minute, let's replicate the soccer culture as it's found in the rest of the world. Once they recognized that was the way to go, that was the real important kind of moment, I think, in terms of the game's ironic mainstream status by not going North American.
Right, and I guess the one of the big questions is, you're saying that soccer is into the mainstream. Has it broken through the media like we prefer it to be? And I guess with Brad working for Sportsnet, we're not too sure if we see soccer as much as we'd like on radio. I certainly know the Fan 590, they talk about it occasionally. TSN, hardly. Maybe it depends whether they're broadcasting a World Cup or something. It just seems like a tough go. It's better than it's been, certainly, 15, 20 years ago. But where do you see that going? Brad, maybe you've got the Sportsnet.
Yeah, I mean, right now, come the World Cup, after the World Cup this year, and the announcement of MLS going to Apple TV next year for the majority of their games, you won't really have any soccer on linear television after the new year. Sportsnet does have the Bundesliga rights, and they do play a fair amount of good games within that. Some of them they do push to their Sportsnet World, pay premium channel. But they do have games that they throw on Sportsnet 1, 360, and even the main channel early in the morning. But more and more you're seeing, and even, with the with now the prevalence of One Soccer being the home of the Canadian national team, the Canadian Premier League, and just Canada, like soccer in Canada, they're pushing hard to try to get into, linear television. And just about a week ago, I know Rogers had put out a massive, I guess they were going, One Soccer had taken them to court. I don't know all the logistics of it, but Rogers definitely put out like a why we can't support having you on our station. And it was basically saying, you look at the attendance numbers and you look at the numbers of how many people are actually watching, because One Soccer was predicated on the funding of CPL ownership. So the CPL, when it was introduced, needed a spot to be have their games broadcast, and that was where One Soccer had originated. But it just seems like, for the most part, whether that's in the mainstream of media in this country, it's kind of gone to a point where it's only big games that we care about, and the smallest friendlies, or the World Cup qualifier versus a minnow like St. Vincent and the Grenadines, you're not getting that many people to watch. I mean, obviously when Canada had their World Cup qualifying through the final stage, the numbers, you were seeing millions and millions, like extreme numbers. But then when you look at the Gold Cup, say, which is like the continent's version of the Euros, or CONMEBOL's version, when South America has theirs tournament for their nation. The Gold Cup doesn't get any, real numbers or anything like that. So it's only when there's a big event that the media really kind of comes out, and then just kind of heads back when there's nothing that's going to really promote, big numbers, because it comes down, obviously, down to a financial, what's in it financially for me or for you from their perspective.
Yeah, of course. And I think, but you look at some of those games, and I'm sure even TFC, I don't know what their numbers are like. I think they're on a rival TV network. Probably not breaking too many records.
No,
but
no, like the CFL will still get, while the Argos, it's very like, while the Argos, their in-person numbers would be, if you looked at the TV numbers of the Argos, it's kind of the exact opposite of like TFC. So that, and attendance. So like TFC attendance up here, Argos down here for attendance. But when you flip it for, actual viewing on TV, it's the complete opposite.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, the whole media thing is changing so quickly and rapidly. I think there's been 3 Blue Jay games in the last month that I wanted to watch that I couldn't watch because they were on Apple TV, and they weren't on my Fubo or my DAZN or any of the other multi platforms that I have to subscribe to now if I want to watch games. And I guess in a way that's just the nature of the way the business is going and the way those markets make sense at some point. But I do have a frustration, like many fans, that I can't see more games.
Yeah, and I know for me, it's frustrating, when I turn on the radio, sports radio, and in the middle of the soccer season, they're talking about sport that's not even playing, and it seems like they're not giving them the time of day. So, if you don't know what's going on in in the trade market or positions or who's playing, who's not, just like they talk about all day long on a hockey player or baseball player, might not be interested enough to watch the game, and so the numbers will probably stay down unless they can get more on mainstream radio or even the news, etc. So, but it was one of your we had Jamie McLeod from President Voyageurs on a past webinar, and he had mentioned that basically, TV stations are in partnership with some of the sports that they've paid so much money to show. So it's going to be tough for soccer to maybe get that much airtime when paid so much. Sportsnet's paid so much for NHL, for example, or NFL or whatever. So when you're trying to get airtime, it's a tough one. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, we have a few more. Well, maybe Brad, you might want to comment on that before I go on to some more question and answers here. We're going to wrap it up soon because it's already over an hour. But yeah, Brad, on that last point.
Yeah, I mean, I can totally see where, like, media companies are trying to capitalize on the properties that they pay, millions and sometimes billions of dollars for getting. And unfortunately, with this sport in this country, we're just not there yet, either through our domestic league and the CPL, or even for that matter, the 3 MLS teams. There's just not enough there to garner that interest. I mean, the way that the MLS is moving, it's still in its infancy from coming in from the mid 90s. Like, you look at these other leagues and they're far more history. So it's still a building process. And I mean, the way that you see MLS and how they're progressing and how they're getting bigger names to come into the league, I think that's only going to drive it, because people don't want to hear about your random guy that grew up in South Jersey. They want to hear about your guy that just won the European Championship and his teammate, in Italy, like a Lorenzo Insigne and Federico Bernardeschi, or even, a Gareth Bale, like an LAFC. These are recognizable names, and for the sport in this country and for the media to really accept it, they they want stars, and that's what you need. You need to have, the more stars that you have, the more chance you have to get into media actually taking you, I guess, for real.
On the other hand, I'm old enough to recall when basically soccer on TV was Gail Barnes on the Multicultural channel for a couple of hours on a Saturday with a replay of a game from a week or two ago. Those were great shows. And I remember I just got a VCR at the time and was taping them all, figuring, well, maybe never I'd be able to see this much soccer ever again in our lives on TV. So on that, at least on that hand, things have improved considerably. You now have tremendous access. Unfortunately, you have to kind of search for it in some respects. And I'm not sure the casual fan is prepared to do that, or the casual sports fan, I should say. Certainly the soccer fan will, but it can be, it is a different world today.
Yeah, and I do see a change because I do coach numerous teams. I got an under-9 boys team, an under-12, and I've got an under-21 team. And sometimes I'll, for example, I was just last weekend talking about to the kids. We're having tryouts, so you guys are on, and then you guys are on deck. You'll be on in a few minutes. And so the kids are looking at me funny, and I realized I didn't know what on deck means. So I asked them, "Do you guys know what on deck means?" And I think out of the, we had 35 kids at a tryout, and maybe one referenced, "Oh, I think it's baseball." So the kids know who's being traded, who's been transferred. Quite often I try and use hockey or baseball or even football terminology, and I'm getting blank stares. So the young kids, they're playing the FIFA games. They're trying the moves that has been programmed on FIFA, and they know a lot. So I do think things are changing.
Esports is big. Esports is big. I think that those are ways that people enter the game now that are, ways that simply weren't there 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, so that's great for the game. So a couple comments. Craig Tower says, I'm a bit behind the conversation, but when the Pilgrim came to North America in 1905, they complained that a defeat to Berlin, Ontario was due to the unnecessary rough play of the Canadians. In Detroit at the time, there were players who felt that was a general characteristic of the Canadian game. I think that was in the book that you mentioned. Canadians are a pretty tough group to play, William.
Yes, yeah, there are some funny examples of that. I talked about the old Darlington Soccer League out where I live in Bowmanville area, and how one of the Englishmen who came and played in the league says they didn't play soccer. They played something closer to hockey, but that was just the nature of the game.
Right. And Jim Leaker, he commented, I think we were talking about St. Louis. There was the same concern about the location of the city team. Now that it's 90% done, all the naysayers are amazed at how beautiful the complex has become.
Yeah.
Training venue with 2 training fields along with the main stadium is fabulous.
Yeah, I'm assuming, Brad, you're going obviously to Qatar in a couple of months' time. You've also got St. Louis somewhere on your itinerary for next year.
St. Louis is definitely one of the, because I do a lot of road trips for TFC. I know I take a proud way of enjoying the fact that I've been to every single TFC playoff game, home or away, since they've ever made it, except for 2020. But that one doesn't count because it was played behind closed doors in Hartford, Connecticut. So that one doesn't count. But yeah, TFC road games are always an amazing time for away days. I went to Nashville this year in their new stadium, which was a great facility. And looking at the St. Louis one, it's definitely on my list with St. Louis barbecue as well. So St. Louis, and want to get back out to LA and see what the LAFC atmosphere out there. I think the the driving point for going on an away day is to go to a stadium where it's a soccer specific stadium and not a, you know, a football or an NFL stadium for the most part. If it's a playoff game, I'll go anywhere, but specifically for an away day for a regular season game, it's got to be a soccer specific stadium. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, we're past our hour, so we're going to have to wrap it up. But once again, the book's called Soccer Triumphant, and it's written by William and Bradley Humber, who are our special guests tonight. And William, I think you have a special offer.
I have a special offer for all of our people that are chimed in here. Send me your full name and mailing address in the next, let's say, 48 hours, and I will arrange to get a book to you. So if you can put that up, my mailing address up online there, or my email address up online. It's wa.humber@gmail.com. So that's W as in water, A as in apple, .humber@gmail.com. And we'll get a book sent out to you. All right, can you do that?
Well, I am not the most technically.
Okay.
See.
Oh, let's see if I can.
Might be able to put it in the chat.
Yeah, I'm just doing that right now. Gee, whoops. No.
And you can always send one to where you registered, info@nscac.ca, or mine is nscac@rogers.com, just in case you can't see. Is it in the chat there? Or I can't see it.
I thought I put it in. Is it showing up in the chat?
I don't see anything.
Oh, I typed it into hosts and panelists. Is there anything else I have to push there?
I think something just.
Oh, you got it, Brad. Yeah,
I did it.
Yep. Good.
There you go.
Excellent. Excellent. So just your full name and mailing address in the next 48 hours, and we'll get a book to you.
Great. Well, thanks very much, folks, for being on our webinar. And we have another one coming up in a couple hours with former national team assistant coach Antonio Flores, and we're looking at the Benito Floro era from, I think it was 2013 to 2016, and we have David Edgar, former national team player, Kenny Samanopoulos, and Izzy as our guests. Unfortunately, David Edgar is on a plane, so he won't be able to join us. And next week we have former Scottish national team coach Craig Brown on. And so they're all free. You just need to register at nscac.ca. Again, Brad and William, thank you very much. The book, Soccer Triumphant, and we'll talk to you guys all soon.
Good to be with you. Cheers.